Hey there, wherever you are, however you are, tonight, we're going back to a time when winter wasn't just a season, it was a challenge, a test of survival, a quiet battle fought not with weapons but with patience and community. If you can take a moment to settle in. Maybe wrap yourself in something warm, perhaps you've got a cup of tea beside you, or the gentle hum of a fan in the background. Whatever comfort surrounds you right now, hold on to it. We're about to step into a world where such comforts were precious and rare. Tonight, we're exploring the lives of medieval peasants during winter, ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with a resilience that's both humbling and inspiring. People who knew cold not as an inconvenience, but as a presence that filled their homes and shaped their days. There's a fascinating paradox in their story. Amidst freezing mud and persistent hunger, despite chilblains and frostbite, in spite of darkness that seemed endless, they survived. Not just survived, but found ways to create moments of warmth and connection even in the harshest conditions imaginable. What can their lives teach us about endurance, about community, about finding light in darkness? That's what we'll discover together in the next hour. This isn't a tale of kings and castles. It's a story about the majority, the everyday people whose quiet courage kept the medieval world turning through the coldest, darkest months of the year. It's about hearts and heartbeats, about breath fogging in cold rooms, about hands sharing warmth when there was nothing else to share. Before we begin our journey back, I want you to know something: there's no pressure here. If this kind of slow, thoughtful exploration speaks to you, please consider leaving a like, but only if you truly enjoy this sort of thing. Your presence alone is what matters most. And I'd love to know, are you listening from somewhere blanketed in snow right now? Or perhaps you're in a place where winter is just a distant concept, a season that happens to other people. Let me know in the comments. There's something meaningful about connecting across time and space, about contemplating winter's bite while in different seasons of our own. Now, let's step back together through centuries, through snowflakes to a world both foreign and familiar. A world where winter wasn't just weather, it was a way of life. Close your eyes for a moment, if you can. Imagine drifting backward through time, through swirling smoke, through centuries of soot, through countless snowfalls that have long since melted into memory. Feel yourself moving through the veil that separates our world from theirs, until finally, you arrive. It's dawn in a medieval village, somewhere in Europe, perhaps the 13th or 14th century. The first thing you notice is the quieter stillness, broken only by the crack of frost surrendering beneath footsteps. And then, there's the cold, not the kind that nips at your nose during a quick dash from car to building, but a deep, pervasive cold that seems to have settled into the very stones of the earth. You stand before a humble cottage. Its walls are wattle and daub, a framework of interwoven sticks packed with mud, straw, and sometimes dung. The roof is thatched, thick layers of reeds or straw bound together, now frosted white in the early morning light. Frost clings to the wooden beams that frame the structure, sparkling in the first rays of sunlight like nature's own decoration. This is home for a peasant family. There are no glass windows here, perhaps small openings covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters, allowing minimal light while trying desperately to keep the cold at bay. There is no central heating, no insulation as we understand it, no thermal socks ordered online, no electric blankets with multiple heat settings. Let's step inside. The air changes immediately. It's still cold, you can see your breath, but there's a difference. The brutal edge of the outdoor chill has been blunted, if not eliminated. The first source of warmth you notice comes from the animals. In many peasant homes, especially the more humble ones, livestock might share the living space during the coldest months. A cow or two, perhaps some chickens, maybe a pig. Their body heat is too valuable to waste in separate structures during winter. The central feature of the home is the hearth, a simple fire pit or rudimentary fireplace with a hood to direct smoke upward. Above, there might be a hole in the roof or a crude chimney, though in many peasant dwellings, the smoke simply finds its way out through the thatch. The fire is modest, wood is precious, especially in winter, but it provides a focal point of heat and light around which all life organizes itself. A family stirs beneath layers of rough blankets and straw bedding. They don't sleep in separate rooms as we do. Privacy is a concept far removed from their reality. Everyone shares the warmth, sleeping close together on straw-stuffed pallets or simple wooden platforms raised slightly off the dirt floor. Some might sleep on benches near the fire. They don't undress fully at night. Their day clothes often serve as their night clothes, with perhaps an extra layer added against the chill. They wrap themselves not just in layers of wool and linen, but in layers of hope that the stored food will last, that the fire won't die out overnight, that illness won't find them when they are most vulnerable. The world outside their door howls and rages with winter's fury, but inside, someone is already awake, stirring a pot of pottage, a thick soup made from whatever vegetables have been preserved. Perhaps a bit of grain, and if they are fortunate, a small piece of salted meat for flavor. This single pot might be the day's main sustenance, kept simmering throughout the hours of light. We enter the Middle Ages not through grand battles or royal proclamations, but through these intimate moments, through breath visible in the morning air, through fingers stiff with cold reaching to stoke dying embers, through the quiet determination to rise and face another winter day. Listen closely and you might hear the straw rustling as someone turns over, trying to find warmth. Feel the rough texture of homespun wool against skin, never completely dry, never truly clean by our standards. Smell the lingering smoke, the earthy scent of bodies and animals sharing space, the faint aroma of last night's meal still hanging in the air. This is winter for the medieval peasant, not a season of holidays and festivities as we know them, but a daily negotiation with survival, a time when every small comfort, a slightly warmer corner by the fire, an extra layer of clothing, a slightly heartier meal represents not luxury, but the thin line between endurance and suffering. Yet even here, in this seemingly harsh existence, there is a profound resilience, a kind of strength we rarely encounter in our temperature-controlled world. These people understood something we've largely forgotten, that winter wasn't an enemy to be conquered with technology, but a teacher to be respected, a season to be weathered through wisdom and community. As the family fully awakens and begins their day, moving slowly, conserving energy and warmth, we begin to understand this is not a life of constant misery, as we might imagine it from our modern perspective. It is simply life accepted, embraced, and lived with a pragmatic grace that deserves our attention. This is where our journey begins, in the cold breath of a winter morning, in a warm bed of straw, in the space between survival and surrender, as the weak winter sun climbs higher. The village gradually awakens, though awakens might suggest more energy than is actually present. In winter, everything in a medieval village moves slowly, but it still moved. Life continued, altered but unbroken by the season's constraints. Unlike us, peasants didn't rise to the mechanical precision of alarm clocks. They woke with the sun, which, in winter, meant rising later and retiring earlier than in summer months. Sometimes, on the darkest, coldest days, they might not fully rise at all, instead remaining in their beds, conserving both warmth and the precious calories their bodies needed to survive. The lingering darkness of winter mornings wasn't fought with electric lights, but was simply accepted as part of the season's rhythm. Work began when visibility allowed and ended when it didn't, a natural pacing that our artificially lit world has all but forgotten. Step outside the cottage now, into the village proper. The fields that in summer would bustle with activity now lie dormant, sleeping beneath frost and occasional snow. But this doesn't mean work ceases entirely. Animals, the crucial living assets of peasant life, still need tending. Livestock must be fed with the fodder stored during autumn's harvest, given water that someone had to break ice to obtain, and checked for signs of illness that could quickly become fatal in winter conditions. This was above all a season of survival, not progress. While the modern world often views winter as a time to push forward with indoor projects, the medieval peasant approached it differently. Winter was when you held your ground, when ambition narrowed to preservation rather than expansion, inside workshops and homes. This meant focusing on maintenance rather than creation. Tools that had served through the busy seasons were now carefully mended, wooden handles smoothed and tightened, metal parts cleaned of rust and resharpened, leather components oiled and stitched, baskets were woven, nets repaired, everyday objects restored to usefulness through patient attention. For women, winter often meant intensified focus on textile work. The shorter days and confined indoor spaces suited the repetitive rhythms of spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into cloth, and crafting cloth into garments. By firelight, fingers worked wool or flax, creating the materials that would clothe the family, or perhaps generate a small income through sale or trade. Children weren't exempt from winter's work rhythm. They collected kindling when weather permitted, helped tend to animals housed indoors, assisted with food preparation, and learned the crafts that would eventually become their livelihoods. Education wasn't formal, but embedded in these daily tasks. Knowledge passed through demonstration and participation rather than books and lessons. Winter in the village was also a time of intensified community. Modern isolation wasn't an option. Survival depended on connection. Neighbors shared more than gossip. They shared embers when a fire went out, a serious emergency in winter. Combined resources for shared meals when individual supplies ran low, and offered labor when illness struck a household. The village church, often the only stone building in smaller settlements, served as more than a religious center. It was a community hub where people could gather in a space marginally warmer than their homes, where news could be exchanged, where the community's collective challenges could be addressed through both practical planning and spiritual comfort. Even when snow or ice made roads nearly impassable, connecting the village to nearby towns or manors, life continued in this smaller, more contained world. Local government still functioned through village elders or representatives. Disputes still needed resolution. Agreements still required witnesses. The mechanics of community continued, adapted to winter's constraints. Markets might be less frequent or more limited in winter, but trade didn't cease entirely. Preserved goods were exchanged, services bartered, and debts settled. The economic life of the village contracted but remained active, focusing more on redistribution of existing resources than on generating new wealth. The pace of everything slowed. Yes, but this slowness wasn't viewed through our modern lens of frustration and impatience. It was simply the natural order, an expected and accepted rhythm. When walking on icy ground, one moves carefully. When resources are limited, one uses them judiciously. When daylight is precious, one prioritizes essential tasks. These weren't conscious philosophical choices but practical adaptations that shaped an entire worldview. And within this slower pace, something emerged that our rushed modern lives often lack: a quality of attention, a depth of presence. Stories told by firelight weren't competing with screens and notifications. Conversations weren't interrupted by digital distractions. Work, though physically harder, often allowed for a mental presence that many of us now struggle to achieve. So as we observe this winter village, with its smoke rising from scattered chimneys, with its paths carved through snow by daily footsteps, with its seemingly muted activity, we are not seeing a community in hibernation. We're witnessing a different mode of existence, one that flows with rather than fights against the season's limitations. The medieval winter village teaches us that sometimes, moving slower isn't falling behind, it's synchronizing with the rhythm that survival requires. That community isn't a luxury but a necessity. That adaptation isn't defeat but wisdom. And even when the roads froze and travel became nearly impossible, even when the wider world seemed cut off by winter's barriers, life quietly, persistently went on. When we imagine medieval clothing, our minds might conjure elaborate court costumes or the romanticized garb of Robin Hood, but for the average peasant in winter, clothing wasn't about fashion or identity, it was purely functional. And sometimes the difference between life and death, The foundation of the peasant's winter wardrobe was wool, nature's most effective insulator even when wet, but this wasn't the soft, processed wool we know today. Medieval wool was often coarse and scratchy, still containing lanolin, the natural oil from sheep, which provided additional water resistance but left a distinct smell and tacky feel against the skin. For men, the basic garment was a woolen tunic, essentially a long shirt reaching to mid-thigh or knee, worn over a linen undertunic if the person was fortunate enough to own more than one layer. Women wore similar tunics, though typically longer, often reaching to the ankles. Both might be belted at the waist with rope or leather, creating a place to hang small tools or pouches. Beneath these, most peasants wore some form of brace, loose, trouser-like undergarments for men, or a simple linen shift for women. Legs were covered with hose, not the sheer nylon we think of today, but essentially separate leg coverings, often made of wool, that could be tied to the belt or to the undergarments. In winter, these basics would be supplemented with whatever additional layers a person owned, perhaps a sleeveless circuit, an overdress or tunic, a hood attached to a short cape called a capuchon, or if they were relatively prosperous, even a simple cloak. The reality, though, is that many peasants owned just one or two sets of clothing in total. A winter tunic might be the same garment worn year-round, perhaps with additional undergarments added in colder months. The idea of seasonal wardrobes was a luxury far beyond their means. This meant that a peasant might wear the same clothing day after day, week after week, throughout the entire winter. Clothing wasn't regularly washed. The combination of cold, lack of effective cleaning agents, and the danger of illness from being in wet clothes made infrequent washing a practical choice rather than a sign of poor hygiene. The smell we would find intolerable was simply the background scent of everyday life. Feet, particularly vulnerable to cold and frostbite, were wrapped in scraps of fabric before being inserted into leather shoes or boots if shoes were owned at all. Many poorer peasants might have wooden clogs or simple leather shoes that offered minimal protection against snow and freezing ground. Some might wrap their footwear in straw for added insulation. Chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels due to cold, were a common affliction of winter feet, along with frostbite in severe cases. Hands were protected with mittens if available, simple pouches of wool or leather with a separate thumb or wrapped in cloth. Many tasks still required bare finger dexterity, however, meaning that hands were repeatedly exposed to cold throughout the day. Heads were almost always covered, not just for warmth but as a social and practical custom. Men wore various caps or hoods, while women typically covered their hair with linen veils, wimples, or simple coifs tied under the chin. In the coldest weather, layers of head coverings might be worn, with hoods pulled up over caps. These garments weren't tailored as we understand the term today. Most clothing was relatively shapeless, made from rectangular pieces of fabric joined with simple seams. Clothing was precious, mended repeatedly, passed down through family members, and used until it literally fell apart. Even then, the fabric might be repurposed into smaller items or rags. The wealthier peasants, those with larger land holdings or specialized crafts, might own leather jerkins, vests which provided excellent wind protection, or garments made from better quality wool, or even occasionally very rough silk. But these were exceptions rather than the rule. What's crucial to understand is that medieval people didn't undress at night as we do today, in unheated homes where temperatures dropped dramatically after sunset. Removing clothes meant losing precious body heat. Most peasants slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, perhaps removing only outer layers if they had them. The concept of specialized sleep attire was centuries away from becoming common practice. Even in bed, warmth was never guaranteed. Peasant beds were typically filled with straw rather than feathers, covered with whatever blankets the family owned, often simple wool, or even just extra clothing layered over the sleepers. Families slept together not just from lack of space but for the essential body heat they shared. In this context, clothing wasn't an expression of personality but a vital survival system. Peasants didn't dress for style, they dressed to not die. they understood intuitively what modern outdoor enthusiasts rediscover with expensive technical gear: that layering natural fibers and protecting extremities are fundamental to cold weather survival. Despite these precautions, winter still exacted its toll. Fingers cracked from cold and repeated exposure to water. Feet developed painful sores and infections. Joints ached from the damp and chill that seemed to seep through even the best protective layers. Skin chapped and split, with chilblains forming painful red patches on exposed areas. And yet, they endured. Day after day, they rose and dressed in the same wool garments, added whatever layers they could manage, and went about the business of staying alive. Their clothing, like every other aspect of their lives, reflected not their preferences but their necessities. This practical relationship with clothing reveals something profound about medieval peasant life, particularly in winter. It wasn't about comfort in the way we understand it, but about sufficiency, not about choice, but about making do, not about self-expression, but about collective wisdom passed through generations about how to layer, what materials worked best, how to extend the life of precious garments, wrapped in their layers of wool. Moving carefully through the frozen world, medieval peasants embodied a silence, not just the physical quiet of snow-muffled landscapes, but the quiet acceptance of hardship as simply part of life's fabric, as natural and expected as the wool they wore against their skin. In the medieval peasant home, the hearth wasn't merely a source of heat or a cooking space, it was the living heart of the household, a presence almost spiritual in its importance, demanding respect, care, and constant attention. To understand winter for the medieval peasant is to understand their relationship with fire. At the center of most one-room cottages was the hearth, sometimes just a fire pit in the middle of the packed earth floor, sometimes a slightly more sophisticated structure against a wall with a hood or crude chimney to direct smoke upward. This wasn't the decorative fireplace of modern homes, with its clean burning logs and glass doors. It was an open flame, often smoking, sometimes sputtering, requiring constant management. Keeping this fire alive was not just a practical task but a sacred duty. Each night, the fire would be banked, covered with a layer of ashes to slow its burning without extinguishing it completely. This preserved precious embers for morning, saving the family from the difficult task of starting a new fire from scratch. The person who rose first, often the woman of the house, would gently uncover these embers, add small kindling, perhaps dried herbs, the smallest twigs, or even dried moss, and carefully nurture the flame back to functional strength. Losing the household fire completely was a genuine crisis, especially in the depths of winter. Starting a new fire with medieval technology, typically flint and steel struck to create sparks, or friction methods like bow drills, was challenging even in good conditions. With cold hands, damp materials, and the pressure of needed warmth, it became extraordinarily difficult. This is why neighbors would sometimes share fire, carrying embers from one household to another in covered containers, a practical necessity that also created community bonds. The fuel for these fires was precious and not always abundant. Wood was the primary fuel, but access to it was often controlled by local lords who owned the forests. Peasants might have rights to collect deadwood or particular types of branches, but these rights were limited and carefully regulated. Cutting living trees without permission could result in severe penalties. In some regions where wood was particularly scarce, peasants might burn dried dung, peat cut from bogs, or even dried seaweed along coastlines. Whatever the fuel, it was never used casually. The modern habit of letting a fire roar for ambience would have seemed unthinkingly wasteful. Medieval fires were kept at the minimum level needed for essential functions, enough to cook food, to provide some warmth, to enable necessary indoor work during dark evenings. The flame was carefully fed, with larger logs saved for the coldest days or most important cooking. The smoke from these fires was a constant companion. Without effective chimneys, a technology that improved but wasn't perfected during the medieval period, much of the smoke remained in the living space, gradually finding its way out through thatch or deliberate holes in the roof. This smoke blackened rafters and thatch, irritated eyes and lungs, and left its scent on everything from clothing to food, but it also served some practical purposes, helping to preserve meat hung from rafters, deterring insects that might otherwise infest thatch, and providing a distinct antibacterial effect in the dwelling. Round this central fire, the rhythm of winter life organized itself. The family gathered close, especially in evenings, creating a small pocket of relative warmth in an otherwise cold home. Work that could be done indoors, repairing tools, spinning wool, mending clothes, was brought into this circle of light and heat. Children learned their first lessons in the flickering glow, absorbing not just practical skills but cultural knowledge as elders told stories that connected them to their community's past and prepared them for their future roles. The hearth was where meals were prepared, typically one-pot dishes that could simmer throughout the day, maximizing fuel efficiency while creating food that provided sustained energy. A cauldron or pot would hang from a hook or rest on a trivet over the fire, containing whatever grain, vegetables, and small amounts of meat or fat. The family could provide a perpetual pottage that might be topped up for days before being started fresh. Beyond cooking, the fire enabled essential winter processing of foods. Grains might be parched to extend their storage life. Meats were smoked for preservation. Herbs were dried for both culinary and medicinal uses. The hearth was both kitchen appliance and food processor, pharmacy and comfort station. The limitations of fire meant that even with this central hearth, medieval homes were far from evenly heated. The warmth radiated in a sphere around the fire, creating concentric circles of decreasing temperature. Those nearest the flame might even feel uncomfortably hot on one side, while their backs remained cold. The furthest corners of the room would remain frigid, with frost sometimes forming on interior walls during the coldest nights. This reality-shaped behavior. Sleeping arrangements prioritized the most vulnerable, the very young, the elderly, the ill, placing them in the warmest locations. Workstations for different tasks would be established based on their heat and light requirements. Even the position of stored food and drink would be carefully considered, keeping items that shortened freeze closest to the hearth's influence. The fire also shaped time, with expensive candles or oil lamps reserved for special needs or wealthier households. The fire provided the primary evening light. Once daylight faded, the sphere of firelight became the boundary of active life. Stories were told, devotions observed, and quiet work completed in this illuminated space, with a natural tendency to retire to bed earlier than in our electrically lit modern world. Children gathered especially close to these flames, not just for physical warmth but for the emotional comfort of light against winter's pressing darkness. It was by firelight that they heard the stories that shaped their understanding of the world, tales of saints and sinners, folklore about the dangerous spirits of winter, practical knowledge disguised as entertaining narratives. Yet for all its importance, even the fire had limits. No matter how well tended, it couldn't fully banish winter from the medieval home. In the corners of the room, away from the hearth's direct influence, winter still waited. Stored water might freeze overnight. Breath would fog visibly in the morning air. The transition from warm bed to cold floor remained a daily shock. This incomplete victory against the cold wasn't seen as failure but as the natural order. The peasant didn't expect to defeat winter entirely, only to negotiate with it, to carve out enough warmth for survival, enough light for necessary tasks, enough cooking heat for sustenance. In this relationship with fire, we see the medieval approach to winter distilled to its essence, not conquering but coexisting. Not eliminating discomfort but managing it, not individualistic self-sufficiency but communal interdependence. The family that shared fire shared life itself, creating not just physical warmth but the emotional heat of connection that made winter's challenges bearable. When we think of hunger in historical contexts, we often imagine dramatic famine, the complete absence of food leading to immediate, visible suffering. But for the medieval peasant in winter, Hunger was rarely so theatrical. Instead, it was a dull, persistent companion, a daily reality managed through careful planning, community support, and adjusted expectations. Winter hunger wasn't about starvation in normal years, it was about scarcity, monotony, and the gradual depletion of both food stores and body reserves. It was the slow lightening of the grain barrel, the shrinking of the cheese wheel, the careful rationing that intensified as winter progressed. The foundation of the medieval peasant diet was grain, primarily rye, barley, and oats, with wheat reserved for those of higher status or special occasions. In summer and autumn, this grain might be baked into bread of varying quality. But in winter, when fuel was precious and more calories were needed, grain often became gruel or pottage, a thick porridge-like mixture that required less fuel to cook and provided sustained energy. This winter pottage wasn't the varied, vegetable-rich stew we might imagine. Freshness was a summer memory, a distant promise of spring. Winter cooking relied almost exclusively on preserved foods, creating meals that sustained life without particularly pleasing the palate. Preservation techniques shaped the winter flavor profile. Salt was the primary preservative for meat when available, typically pork from the household pig slaughtered at the beginning of winter. This salted meat wasn't consumed in large quantities, but used sparingly to flavor the pottage. A small piece might simmer in the pot for days, extracted only to be replaced when its flavor was fully depleted. Smoking was another crucial preservation method, especially in regions where salt was expensive. Hams and other meats would hang from rafters, gradually absorbing the smoke from the daily fire, developing intense flavors while becoming less hospitable to bacteria. These too were used judiciously, often as flavoring rather than main components of meals. Dairy entered the winter diet primarily as cheese, hard, aged varieties that could last through the season without spoiling. Fresh milk was scarce as cows produced less during winter months, and what they did produce was often reserved for young children or made immediately into storable forms. Vegetables in winter came from storage rather than garden. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots could be kept in cool, dry conditions for months. Cabbages might be preserved through fermentation, as sauerkraut, onions and garlic would be braided and hung from rafters. Dried peas and beans provided crucial protein when meat was unavailable. Fruits were largely absent except in dried form. Apples might be sliced and dried in autumn, or preserved as cider. Nuts gathered in fall could provide concentrated nutrition and welcome textural variety to the winter diet when available. Herbs weren't just flavoring but medicine. Dried bundles of thyme, rosemary, sage, and local wild herbs would be used both to make bland food more palatable and to treat winter illnesses. The distinction between food and medicine was often blurred, with certain preparations serving both purposes simultaneously. The winter diet was notably lacking in fresh greens, a deficiency that could lead to various health problems by late winter, including scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. Savvy peasants might know which wild plants could be foraged even in winter: chickweed, young nettles, certain tree barks to supplement their diet with crucial nutrients. Preserved fish, dried, salted, or smoked, was an important protein source in coastal regions or areas with well-established trade routes. In inland regions, freshwater fish might be caught through holes cut in frozen ponds or streams, providing rare fresh food in midwinter. The rhythm of eating changed with the season. The 3 daily meals of active seasons might contract to 2 or even 1 substantial meal during winter, with food carefully rationed. This wasn't just cultural but practical. Fewer daylight hours for work meant fewer periods of intense energy expenditure. And conserving fuel by cooking less frequently was sensible resource management. As winter progressed, the quality and quantity of available food typically diminished. Grain might develop mustins, the last preserved vegetables might wrinkle and soften, the final portions of meat might be mainly fat and gristle. But nothing edible was wasted. Ingenuity found uses for every scrap, every seed, every bone. When supplies ran dangerously low, Especially in late winter before spring's first growth, communities relied on each other, those with surplus shared with those facing shortage, not from pure altruism, though community bonds were real, but from the practical recognition that mutual survival required cooperation. Today's giver might be tomorrow's recipient. Local lords sometimes provided relief in the form of grain distributions or soup kitchens, particularly in harsh winters. This wasn't pure charity, but a recognition of their responsibility to keep their workforce alive and capable. Churches and monasteries also played crucial roles in feeding the desperately hungry, especially in urban areas. In truly dire circumstances, peasants turned to famine foods, items not normally considered edible but capable of sustaining life. Bark bread, made by adding ground tree bark, usually elm or pine, to extend meager flour supplies, was a documented strategy. Wild plants normally avoided for their bitter taste became acceptable. Even leather items might be boiled to extract any remaining nutrition in extreme cases. But beyond the physical reality of winter food, there was a psychological dimension that modern abundance makes difficult for us to understand. Medieval peasants didn't expect every meal to be satisfying or delicious. They didn't anticipate variety or freshness in winter. The modern concept of food as pleasure, as entertainment, as self-expression would have seemed bizarre when viewed from their perspective of food as simple survival, and yet, there were moments of relative abundance even in winter. Special occasions, Christmas, local saints' days, weddings might feature slightly better food, perhaps a bit more meat in the pot, a rare sweet treat made with precious honey, or bread made from finer flour saved for the purpose. These celebrations weren't lavish by our standards but represented significant departures from daily fare. Faith played a crucial role in the psychology of winter eating. Religious fasting periods, particularly Advent and Lent, which often fell during the leanest times, gave spiritual meaning to physical scarcity. Hunger became not just deprivation but devotion. Not just lack but spiritual practice. This mental framing didn't eliminate physical suffering but provided a framework for understanding it beyond mere misfortune. And sometimes, when supplies truly ran low and options narrowed to almost nothing, people leaned not just on each other but on faith itself. Prayers for provision weren't abstract theological exercises but urgent petitions born of genuine need. Stories of miraculous provision, a sudden catch of fish, an unexpected gift, a forgotten store discovered just in time, weren't mere legends but real experiences that reinforced belief in divine care even in the darkest, coldest, hungriest moments of winter. In the medieval village, night fell early during winter months, but sleep was nothing like what we experience today. The silence we associate with bedtime would have been foreign to medieval peasants. Sleep was a communal affair, born of necessity rather than preference. A single household often shared not just one room, but one bed, a large platform where parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even distant relatives would lie together under whatever coverings they could gather. This arrangement wasn't about familial closeness as much as survival. Body heat was precious currency in a world without central heating. The more bodies pressed together, the warmer everyone stayed. On particularly brutal nights, even animals might join this strange communion. Dogs, cats, and sometimes even small livestock brought indoors not out of sentiment, but practicality. A cow's breath could warm a small space considerably, and this mutual arrangement helped both humans and beasts survive until dawn. The beds themselves bore little resemblance to our modern concept. The frame, if there was one at all, would be wooden planks elevated slightly off the ground to avoid the worst of the drafts that swept across dirt floors. The mattress was typically a coarse sack filled with straw, which crackled and shifted with every movement. While uncomfortable by our standards, straw provided surprising insulation from the cold below. In more prosperous homes, wool might be added to the mattress stuffing, providing additional warmth but also attracting insects and requiring regular airing. What we would call bedding was scanty at best. Blankets were precious possessions, often made from roughly woven wool that was simultaneously scratchy and vital. Many households possessed only one or two proper blankets, which would be reserved for the youngest and oldest family members. Others made do with cloaks, spare clothing, or even sacks repurposed as coverings. The concept of sheets was largely unknown among common folk. They slept in their day clothes, merely removing outer layers if they had any. Sleep patterns differed dramatically from our modern expectation of 8 uninterrupted hours. Medieval people typically slept in segments, what historians now call first sleep and second sleep. They would retire shortly after sunset, sleep for several hours, then awaken around midnight. This wakeful period might last an hour or more, during which people would tend the fire, check on children or elderly relatives, perhaps pray, talk quietly, or even visit neighbors before returning to second sleep until dawn. This biphasic pattern wasn't considered unusual or problematic. It was simply how humans had slept for centuries. The physical experience of sleeping in winter had sensory dimensions we can barely imagine today. As fires died down, breath would become visible in the cold air above beds. People would pull covers over their faces, creating small warm pockets in which to breathe. The sounds of the night were intimate and varied: the deep breathing of family members, occasional coughs or murmurs, the shifting of straw beneath bodies, the creak of wooden beams contracting in the cold, and perhaps the soft rustling of mice seeking warmth in dark corners. Dreams came differently in such conditions. Modern sleep research suggests that physical discomfort and cold temperatures fragment sleep patterns and intensify dream states. Medieval people lived in a world where the boundary between dreaming and wakefulness was perhaps more permeable. Their nights punctuated by brief periods of consciousness as they adjusted positions or pulled coverings tighter against the cold. Despite these hardships, they did sleep, finding rest through necessity and adaptation. The human body, remarkably resilient, adjusted to conditions we would find intolerable. Children born into this world knew nothing different. The shared warmth of family members pressed close was their normal. The rhythm of collective breathing their lullaby. What we might view as deprivation was to them simply night, the necessary counterpart today, to be endured until the sun returned with its promise of light and relative warmth. Winter brought no respite from labor in the medieval village. If anything, survival demanded even greater effort when cold threatened to steal both food and life itself. While modern minds might imagine a hibernation-like state during winter months, the reality was a continuous, careful choreography of necessary work performed under challenging conditions. The blacksmith's forge became the literal and figurative heart of the winter village. As temperatures plummeted, the smithy's workspace burned with renewed importance, the glowing forge reaching temperatures of nearly 30 degrees Fahrenheit cast both light and precious heat into the darkest season. Iron didn't acknowledge winter's arrival. Plows still needed mending, horseshoes required replacing, and tools demanded repair regardless of the frost that formed on the smithy's beard between hammer strikes. The constant ping of metal striking metal became winter's stubborn percussion. A reminder that human industry continued despite nature's apparent dormancy. For those with less dramatic occupations, work simply moved indoors but never ceased. Women's labor intensified during winter months. Spinning wool was particularly crucial, a task requiring dexterity that diminished as fingers numbed in unheated homes. Yet they persisted, drawing out fibers hour after hour by firelight, their spinning wheels creating another rhythm that underscored village life. The thread and yarn produced during these dark months would become the family's clothing, blankets, and perhaps items to trade when spring markets reopened. The clickety-clack of looms joined the symphony of winter sounds as women transformed summer's wool into winter's survival. Food preparation took different forms but demanded no less attention. Preservation became an ongoing process, checking stored vegetables for signs of rot, monitoring precious grain supplies for evidence of rodents, smoking the last of autumn's meat to extend its viability, bread making continued regardless of temperature, though dough rose more slowly in the cold, requiring experienced hands to judge its readiness by feel rather than time. Men who worked fields during warmer months found different employment. Woodcutting intensified, with felled trees requiring processing into usable firewood. Hunting, though challenging in snow, provided crucial protein when successful. Repairs to homes and barns became urgent rather than optional. A leaking roof that might be tolerable in summer became life-threatening when snow could enter and melt among a family's few possessions. Children were not exempt from winter's work demands. Their smaller fingers, though equally cold, could manage delicate tasks like mending nets or sorting seeds for spring planting. They became messengers between households, fetching and carrying items that adults couldn't spare time to exchange. Older children minded younger ones, allowing parents to focus on critical tasks. They gathered kindling smaller branches and twigs that would catch fire quickly and help ignite larger logs. Even play had purpose. Games often incorporated skills they would need as adults. Practicing adult roles in miniature while still finding moments of joy in snow and ice. The elderly contributed according to their abilities. No longer strong enough for physical labor, they became the keepers and teachers of crucial knowledge: when to plant by the moon's phase, how to predict weather from cloud patterns, which herbs might reduce a fever. Their experienced eyes could spot the signs of impending storms before younger generations recognized the warnings. They maintained oral traditions, passing stories and practical wisdom to new generations as they all worked beside the hearth. The combined effect of all this necessary labor was a village in perpetual, quiet motion, not frantic, but steady and purposeful. Winter's work rhythm differed from summer's more visible field labor, but was no less essential. Hands moved continuously, chopping, stirring, mending, creating their very movement, generating body heat that helped keep their owners alive. The medieval person understood something we've largely forgotten: idle hands in winter weren't just wasteful, they were cold hands, potentially dangerous to survival. This continuous industry created what modern observers might call slow productivity, not the frantic pace of our digital workdays, but the steady accumulation of necessary tasks completed despite environmental challenges. The village became a collective organism, each person contributing to its survival through specialized but interconnected labor. When viewed as a whole, this winter work pattern reveals not just subsistence, but a kind of quiet dignity, humans refusing to surrender to elements that threatened their existence. Finding purpose in the daily tasks that kept death at bay for another day, another week, another season. As winter descended and darkness claimed more hours than light, the medieval mind turned increasingly to explanations beyond the physical world. The marriage of Christian faith and older folk beliefs created a complex spiritual landscape that helped people comprehend and endure winter's hardships. This wasn't superstition in the dismissive modern sense, it was a necessary framework for understanding a world where survival was never guaranteed. The medieval church calendar provided structure during winter's disorienting darkness. Advent marked not just spiritual preparation, but practical anticipation. 4 weeks to complete necessary work before Christmas brought brief respite. The Christmas celebration itself was far from our commercial holiday. It represented light's promise returning to the world during the darkest time. Church services became more than religious obligations. There were opportunities to gather in stone buildings that, while drafty, still offered shelter and community warmth, as candles illuminated manuscripts and hopeful faces alike. Parish priests became more than spiritual leaders during winter months. They were conduits of divine protection when nature seemed most hostile. Blessings were sought for everything: homes, food stores, livestock, even wells that might freeze. These weren't empty rituals but practical spiritual technology in a world where unseen forces were believed to determine survival. The church bells toll measured days when sun patterns were obscured by storm clouds, providing temporal orientation when natural markers disappeared under snow. Yet Christianity coexisted with older beliefs that the Church had never fully displaced. Winter intensified this dual spiritual reality. Folklore provided explanations for winter phenomena that science couldn't yet address. The severe pain of frostbite became the devil's pinch, a physical manifestation of evil that required both practical treatment and spiritual intervention. Unusual winter storms weren't just weather patterns but evidence of restless spirits or supernatural conflicts happening in parallel to human struggles. The solstice period, which Christianity had deliberately overlaid with Christmas, retained its ancient significance. The year's longest night triggered rituals of light and vigilance that predated Christianity, but continued under new names and justifications. Families kept hearth fires burning continuously during this period, an ancient practice recast as honor to the Christ child, but still serving the practical purpose of warding off both physical and metaphysical darkness. Winter nights stretched human imagination along with human endurance. Stories told beside fires weren't merely entertainment, but educational tools and psychological comfort. Tales of ancestors who survived worse winters reinforced community resilience. Folk stories featuring clever heroes outwitting winter demons offered metaphorical strategies for facing real challenges. Saints' lives, particularly those associated with winter protection like Saint Nicholas or Saint Lucy, provided divine role models specially attuned to seasonal needs. The boundary between visible and invisible worlds seemed thinnest during winter. Unexplained sounds outside snow-covered homes became wandering souls rather than wind patterns. The strange blue light sometimes visible over frozen lakes wasn't recognized as methane, but interpreted as either blessed protection or dangerous enticement, depending on local tradition. Even breath vapor, the visible exhalation in cold air, carried spiritual significance as visible evidence of the life force temporarily leaving the body with each breath. Prayers assumed particularly urgent quality during winter, especially during illness when mortality rates soared. Families developed specific winter invocations for protection against cold, hunger, and the particular diseases that flourished in confined living conditions. These prayers combined Orthodox Christian language with localized additions that the Church might officially disapprove of but practically tolerated. Recognizing their importance to community cohesion, death came more frequently in winter, necessitating spiritual frameworks to process loss when ground was too frozen for proper burial. Bodies might need storing until spring thaw allowed grave digging, creating an uncomfortable reminder of mortality's presence. Communities developed specific rituals for these waiting dead, ensuring their souls received proper attention while their bodies awaited Earth's embrace. This rich tapestry of belief, Christian doctrine interwoven with folk wisdom and ancient practice, provided crucial psychological sustenance during winter's physical deprivations. Faith and folklore together created an explanatory system that made suffering comprehensible, if not always easier to bear. When material resources ran low, spiritual resources helped fill the gap. The unseen world offered both comfort and caution, helping communities navigate winter's physical and psychological challenges with tools beyond the merely tangible. The medieval social hierarchy never revealed itself more starkly than during winter months. While peasants huddled in drafty cottages, the lord's manor house stood as a stone monument to inequality, its multiple fireplaces burning continuously, its windows better sealed, its pantries considerably fuller. This contrast wasn't just material comfort, it represented fundamentally different winter experiences within the same geographical space. Manor houses were designed with winter in mind in ways that peasant dwellings could never achieve. Multiple hearths provided heat throughout larger structures. Better construction meant fewer drafts. Thick stone walls, while initially cold, retained heat once warmed. Tapestries hung not merely as decoration but as crucial insulation, trapping warmth and reducing echo in high silent great halls. Even window coverings reflected status. Wooden shutters in peasant homes versus oiled parchment or even early glass in manorial windows. allowing some light while better excluding wind. The Lord's table maintained abundance even as winter thinned supplies elsewhere. Hunting privileges reserved game for noble consumption, with poaching even when motivated by hunger severely punished. Spices that could mask the taste of aging meat were luxury imports available only to the wealthy. Winter feasts in the Great Hall showcased this differential access to resources, with Christmas celebrations serving simultaneously as religious observance, social reinforcement, and conspicuous consumption that demonstrated the Lord's continued prosperity despite seasonal challenges. The question of noblesse obliged, the obligation of the privileged to care for their dependents, found its greatest test during winter months. Historical records reveal wide variation in how individual lords responded to this responsibility. The medieval ideal promoted through church teaching and vivaric literature emphasized generosity toward the less fortunate, particularly during Christ's nativity season. Some lords embraced this ethos, distributing food, firewood, and clothing to struggling tenants. Others viewed such charity as optional at best, maintaining that peasants should manage with their own resources regardless of unusual hardship. Almsgiving became more formalized during winter. Many manors established specific days when bread, preserved food, or even small coins might be distributed to the poorest villagers. These distributions weren't designed to eliminate suffering but to mitigate its worst effects and demonstrate the Lord's Christian virtue. Recipients were often expected to pray for their benefactor's soul in return, a spiritual transaction that benefited both parties according to medieval understanding, providing material aid to the poor and divine credit to the wealthy. The lady of the manor often played a crucial role in winter charity. While the Lord handled matters of justice and overall management, his wife typically oversaw household affairs, including the allocation of resources to dependents. Manor accounts show some ladies maintaining detailed records of which families received what assistance, ensuring equitable distribution within the constraints of limited generosity. The lady's practical knowledge of food preservation and textile production made her particularly valuable in assessing and addressing winter needs among the estate's people. Justice operated differently during winter months. Courts still functioned, but travel difficulties meant cases might be delayed. Some minor offenses received reduced punishment when motivated by winter desperation, while others, particularly those threatening communal survival like grain theft, might see harsher penalties. The Lord's role as judge became especially consequential when scarcity heightened tensions within the community. Some enlightened lords recognized that peasant survival directly impacted their own prosperity. Dead or debilitated tenants couldn't work fields come spring. Children weakened by winter hunger would become less productive adults. This pragmatic understanding sometimes prompted preventive measures, ensuring adequate grain storage before winter, maintaining fish ponds that could provide protein when other sources failed, or allowing controlled gathering of deadwood from estate forests. Such provisions weren't universal but represented a practical approach to manorial management that benefited all parties. The physical distance between manor house and village sometimes reflected psychological distance in understanding. Lords who spent winters elsewhere, perhaps at court or in more comfortable urban residences, might remain ignorant of their peasants' winter conditions until returning in spring. Those who remained on their estates throughout the year generally developed more responsive management approaches. Having witnessed firsthand the challenges their dependents faced, peasants developed complex attitudes toward their lord's winter role, gratitude for assistance mixed with resentment of inequity. Dependence coexisted with developing self-reliance. Communities learned which needs might receive manorial support, and which they must address internally. This relationship, neither fully antagonistic nor truly harmonious, shaped medieval rural society, with winter's stresses exposing both its functional and dysfunctional aspects. The most successful estates developed symbiotic rather than merely extractive relationships. Lords who ensured their peasants survived winter in reasonable condition maintained a more productive workforce for the agricultural season. Peasants who received adequate support during hardship demonstrated greater loyalty during prosperous times. This balance, when achieved, created resilience that benefited the entire community, though history suggests it was an ideal more frequently described than realized. The acoustic landscape of medieval winter differed profoundly from our modern experience today. We move between artificially maintained environments with consistent sound profiles, the hum of heating systems, the white noise of electronics, the unchanged volume of human voices regardless of season. Medieval people inhabited a world where winter transformed not just visuals but auditory experience, creating a distinct soundscape that marked the season as surely as bare trees and fallen snow. Snow's acoustic properties fundamentally altered the winter environment. Fresh snowfall absorbed sound waves rather than reflecting them, creating a muffling effect that could be both peaceful and disorienting. Familiar paths through villages suddenly carried less auditory information, footsteps deadened, voices strangely absorbed rather than echoing off buildings. This snow-induced quiet was so distinctive that medieval languages developed specific terms for it, words that simultaneously described both the visual whiteness and the unusual silence. Yet this hush was never complete silence. It formed instead a transformed acoustic backdrop against which certain sounds gained new prominence. The crack of ice on a pond, sharp and sudden, might carry for surprising distances. Frozen tree branches creaked under snow weight with distinctive groans. The crystalline quality of extreme cold created conditions where sound traveled differently, sometimes carrying conversations from far greater distances than summer air would permit, leading to careful speech when outdoors less private words find unintended listeners. Animal sounds shifted with the season. Livestock brought closer to human habitation for protection created new acoustic patterns, the lowing of cattle from attached byres rather than distant fields, the nervous shuffling of sheep in makeshift winter pens. Wild creatures altered their communication patterns. Wolves howled more frequently when hunting became difficult, their voices carrying across snow-covered landscapes as both warning and territorial claim. Even the ordinary scratching of mice within walls became more noticeable as families spent more time indoors. Attuned to household sounds, human-generated sounds took on seasonal characteristics. The rhythmic chopping of firewood became winter's heartbeat, regular, necessary, continuing from dawn until approaching darkness made axe work dangerous. Inside homes, distinctive winter activities created their own soundtrack. The scrape of wooden spoons against pot bottoms as increasingly scarce food required thorough collection, the whir of spinning wheels working through long evenings, the snap of mending needles pulled through worn fabric being repaired during months when outdoor work diminished. Conversation itself changed character. Families gathered closer to hearths, spoke more softly, conserving energy in cold rooms. Stories told during winter evenings took on ritualistic qualities, tales repeated annually during specific dark periods, their familiar cadences providing psychological comfort alongside entertainment value. The human voice itself carries differently in cold, dry air versus warm, humid conditions. Winter speech acquired a particular timbre that subtly signaled the season. Transport sounds transformed dramatically. The particular squeak of footsteps on packed snow announced pedestrians before they came into view. Wheeled vehicles largely disappeared, replaced by runners. The distinctive swish of sleds or sleighs moving across snow created a transportation soundtrack unlike summer's rumbling cartwheels. Horse hooves landed differently on frozen ground versus summer dust or spring mud, creating sharp, clear impacts rather than muffled thuds. The built environment generated its own winter acoustics. Timbers in buildings contracted in cold, creating occasional sharp cracks as structural elements adjusted. Thatch roofs, frozen rather than flexible, received snow with a different sound than rain. Shutters rattled differently in winter winds versus summer breezes. their movements more urgent and insistent during storms. Even doors opened differently. Wood swollen with dampness might scrape thresholds with distinctive reluctance. Fire sounds assumed central importance. The specific crackle of different wood types became crucial knowledge. Oak burning differently than pine, ash providing different acoustic feedback than elm. Families learned to read their fires through sound as well as sight. Distinguishing between the healthy pop of properly dried wood versus the dangerous hiss of moisture-laden logs that might create chimney-clogging creosote. The collapse of partially burned logs carried information about when new fuel needed adding without requiring constant visual monitoring. Wind deserves special mention in the medieval winter soundscape. Without machine noise to mask it, wind became winter's voice, sometimes howling through village streets, sometimes whispering around corners, sometimes screaming down chimneys. Its variations carried weather forecasting information that experienced listeners could interpret. Certain tones predicted snow. Others suggested clearing conditions. Wind-driven snow created its own distinctive patter against walls and windows, a sound unmistakably different from rain, and uniquely associated with winter's challenges. Perhaps most importantly, this distinctive winter soundscape created perfect conditions for oral tradition to flourish. The combination of enforced indoor proximity, reduced outdoor work, and long darkness created ideal circumstances for storytelling, singing, and the transmission of cultural knowledge. Winter nights became acoustic archives where community memory lived in voiced form, passing between generations through patterns of sound that helped preserve crucial information while strengthening social bonds. The particular hush of winter provided the perfect acoustic backdrop for human voices to carry wisdom across generations. Winter compressed the age spectrum of medieval society, bringing its youngest and oldest members into closer proximity than any other season. This forced intimacy revealed both tensions and synergies between life's beginning and ending stages, creating intergenerational dynamics that helped communities survive the harshest months while transferring crucial knowledge between age groups. Children experienced winter through a paradoxical lens of restriction and opportunity. The freedom of summer, running through fields, exploring forests, escaping constant adult supervision, vanished with the first heavy snowfall. Physical boundaries contracted as outdoor spaces became uncomfortable or dangerous. Yet within these constraints, medieval children found distinctive winter pleasures that modern children might envy despite their material advantages. Snow itself became a play resource requiring no additional equipment. Sledding required only a repurposed wooden board or a scrapped barrel stave. Sliding across frozen ponds, dangerous but exhilarating, required nothing but sturdy shoes or, for the fortunate, animal bone tied beneath footwear as primitive skates. Snowball fights followed the same basic rules across centuries and cultures. Snow figures gazed with coal eyes just as they do today. The fundamental childhood joy in winter's transformed landscape transcended material poverty. Indoor play adapted to winter conditions. Games requiring minimal space and equipment gained prominence. Knucklebones, similar to jacks, cup and ball, and string games passed time while developing dexterity. Storytelling became participatory entertainment, with children acting out familiar tales in cramped quarters. Even chores became socialized activities. Children working together to card wool or shell nuts incorporated competitive elements that transformed work into play. At the opposite end of life's spectrum, elders faced winter with complex emotions. Physical vulnerability increased as aging bodies struggled more intensely with cold and reduced activity. Joint pain intensified, mobility decreased on icy surfaces, and various chronic conditions worsened in cold, damp environments. Yet winter simultaneously elevated elders' social value within the community. Their accumulated knowledge, which seasons of plenty might render seemingly obsolete, suddenly regained crucial importance. Elderly community members served as living almanacs and instruction manuals. Their experience-based weather prediction often proved more reliable than general knowledge. As they'd observed local patterns across decades, they remembered previous extreme winters and which survival strategies had proved effective. Their knowledge of food preservation techniques, exactly how long certain stores should last, which items to consume first, how to stretch provisions by combining ingredients, became life-saving information during extended cold periods. The medicinal knowledge of older women gained particular importance. Winter illnesses required treatment with stored herbs and preserved remedies rather than fresh plants. Grandmothers and great-aunts maintained mental inventories of which preparations addressed which symptoms, how dosages should adjust for different ages, and which warning signs indicated serious versus minor conditions. This healthcare system, while limited by modern standards, represented sophisticated empirical knowledge developed across generations. The physical proximity imposed by winter created unavoidable intergenerational contact. Multiple generations sharing limited heated space meant children observed elders' daily routines and adaptive strategies firsthand. Elders similarly witnessed childhood development up close, offering correction, instruction, and occasional indulgence as appropriate. This forced proximity had both positive and challenging aspects. Privacy became nearly non-existent. Irritations couldn't be escaped through physical separation, and different age-based needs sometimes competed for limited resources. Birth and death biology's endpoints often occurred within the same small spaces during winter. Midwives delivered babies by firelight, often with other family members present due to space constraints. The entire life cycle unfolded within communal view. Children witnessed birth, aging, and death as natural processes rather than medicalized events hidden behind institutional walls. When an elderly person died during winter, their body might remain in the dwelling until ground thawed enough for burial, creating an intimate relationship with mortality that modern societies have largely eliminated. The metaphorical significance of this age juxtaposition wasn't lost on medieval people, who recognized profound symbolic patterns in natural cycles. Winter represented both death of the old year of vegetation and gestation, as seeds waited beneath snow, as livestock carried spring offspring. Human parallels were obvious: elders approaching life's winter, while children represented future renewal. This cyclical understanding provided psychological comfort during physically uncomfortable months, suggesting continuity beyond individual lifespan. Children born during winter months a relatively common occurrence, given conception patterns following harvest. Abundance arrived into a world of immediate challenge. Yet winter births also received advantages. Mothers could remain indoors focusing on recovery and nursing rather than field work, and the entire household was available to assist with newborn care. Community attention concentrated on these winter rivals, with their survival representing collective hope during the year's darkest period. The interactions between youngest and oldest family members created knowledge transfer pathways that formal education couldn't replicate. Grandparents teaching grandchildren ensured that specialized information craft techniques, local history, practical skills passed directly between non-adjacent generations. Children absorbed not just information but worldview, learning how to conceptualize challenges through the lens of experienced survivors. What modern educators might call tacit knowledge, difficult to articulate but crucial to success, flowed naturally through these extended winter interactions. This intergenerational circle, enforced by winter's constraints, ensured community resilience through complementary contributions. The physical strength of adults, the enthusiasm and adaptability of children, and the wisdom of elders combined to create survival units more effective than any single age group could manage alone. Winter's challenges thus paradoxically strengthened social bonds that supported community throughout the annual cycle, demonstrating that human connection itself was perhaps the most essential survival tool in the medieval world. What enabled medieval people to survive winter after winter, generation after generation, without the material comforts we consider essential? The answer lies not in some superhuman endurance our ancestors possessed, but in a complex combination of practical knowledge, social structures, and psychological frameworks that modern life has largely rendered unnecessary yet perhaps not entirely obsolete. Their resilience began with pragmatic acceptance. Medieval people harbored no illusion that winter could be avoided or substantially softened. Unlike our modern expectation that indoor temperatures should remain constant regardless of season, they anticipated discomfort as inevitable. This mental preparation, the absence of expectation that life should remain comfortable, created psychological readiness for hardship that paradoxically made hardship easier to bear. They measured winter's severity not against an ideal of comfort, but against memories of worst winters past, finding reassurance when current conditions didn't reach historical extremes. Knowledge accumulation and transmission played crucial roles in winter survival. Communities maintained collective memories of effective strategies, refining them across generations. This wasn't static tradition, but adaptive learning techniques that failed were abandoned, while successful innovations spread rapidly through necessity-driven networks. The medieval person possessed astonishing practical knowledge exactly how long certain foods remained viable under specific storage conditions, precisely which types of wood generated most heat with least smoke, exactly how thick ice needed to be before bearing weight safely. This granular, experience-based knowledge represented genuine expertise that no single guidebook contained, but communities preserved through practiced wisdom. Social cohesion intensified during winter months out of pure necessity, while summer allowed more individualistic pursuits. Winter demanded coordination. Labor sharing became more formalized. A household with adequate firewood might assist neighbors with less access to forests. Families with surplus preserved foods might exchange with those possessing different resources. These weren't merely charitable arrangements, but mutual survival agreements that recognized interdependence. Status distinctions didn't disappear, but practical cooperation often transcended social boundaries when survival required collective action. The psychological dimensions of winter endurance deserve particular attention. Medieval people possessed frameworks for understanding suffering that modern societies have largely abandoned. Religious belief provided cosmic context for physical hardship, suggesting that earthly discomfort served spiritual purposes while promising eventual reward. Seasonal suffering wasn't meaningless but part of divine design, testing faith while building character. Simultaneously, folk traditions offered practical coping mechanisms, festivals punctuating winter's length at strategic intervals, stories emphasizing ancestors who endured worse conditions, communal activities that transformed necessity into social occasions. Perhaps most significantly, medieval people maintained intimate connection with seasonal rhythms that modernity has systematically severed. They experienced winter not as inconvenience but as necessary counterpart to summer's growth and natural balancing that required human adaptation rather than resistance. This acceptance didn't eliminate suffering but contextualized it within larger patterns, providing reassurance that spring's return, while not guaranteed for any individual, remained cosmically certain. The predictable cycle itself offered comfort even when immediate circumstances provided none. What relevance does this medieval winter resilience hold for us today? Our centrally heated homes and well-stocked supermarkets have eliminated most physical challenges our ancestors faced, yet certain aspects of their experience continue resonating across centuries, suggesting enduring human needs that transcend technological change. Consider our continued fascination with fire. Even in homes where flames serve no practical heating purpose, decorative fireplaces and candles remain perennially popular. This attraction transcends mere aesthetics. Something primordial responds to contained fire. Particularly during dark months, the medieval peasant's essential relationship with flame has become our optional indulgence, yet satisfies similar psychological needs for visual warmth and light against darkness. Our social patterns still shift seasonally despite climate control. Winter continues drawing people toward communal activities, holiday gatherings, shared meals, indoor entertainment experienced collectively. The medieval necessity of winter togetherness has transformed into cultural preference, but retains similar function in combating isolation during months when exterior landscapes appear less welcoming. Digital platforms increasingly facilitate these connections when physical gathering becomes difficult, serving functions analogous to medieval storytelling traditions by maintaining community bonds across distance. Contemporary winter celebrations, though commercialized and often disconnected from original meanings, still serve psychological purposes similar to their medieval counterparts. They punctuate winter's psychological weight at strategic intervals, creating anticipation and memory markers that help segment seemingly endless dark periods. The medieval Christmas, Candlemas, and pre-Lenten celebrations have modern counterparts that, despite changed content, fulfill similar calendar structuring functions. Perhaps most poignantly, our relationship with winter remains ambivalent in ways our ancestors would recognize. We simultaneously dread its inconveniences while romanticizing its quiet beauty. We complain about darkness while creating deliberately cozy environments with subdued lighting. We seek to control winter's effects while periodically embracing its distinctive experiences through activities like skiing or ice skating. This contradiction, wishing to eliminate winter's discomforts while retaining its aesthetic and recreational benefits, reveals our complicated relationship with seasonal extremes. What we've undeniably lost is winter's teaching function. Medieval people necessarily learned patience, resource management, and community interdependence through winter's unavoidable constraints. These lessons came at tremendous cost: illness, hunger, and premature death that we rightly celebrate eliminating. Yet something valuable accompanied those harsh tutorials: deep appreciation for abundance when it returned, practical knowledge of essential versus optional needs, and recognition of human interdependence not as political theory but lived reality. Perhaps winter still offers modern lessons if we remain attentive. In power outages that occasionally strip away technological buffers, we rediscover neighbors and mutual aid. During snowstorms that temporarily halt normal activities, we remember how to improvise and prioritize. In seasonal transitions that continue despite climate control, we glimpse the natural patterns our ancestors knew intimately. Winter, even in its moderated modern form, still whispers of human vulnerability and resilience if we pause our digital distractions long enough to listen. The medieval peasants' winter world has vanished irretrievably, and we need not romanticize genuine suffering, yet their methods of endurance, community connection, resourceful adaptation, finding meaning within constraint, and maintaining hope through darkest periods remain relevant templates for human resilience. Their winter wisdom, owned through generations of necessary hardship, might still illuminate our comparatively comfortable darkness if we recognize that certain human needs transcend technological transformation. As our journey through medieval winter draws to its close, imagine yourself sitting in your comfortable modern room as evening deepens. Perhaps a heater hums somewhere nearby, maintaining perfect temperature without conscious thought. Electric lights can banish darkness at the flick of a switch. Food waits in refrigerator and pantry, requiring minimal preparation. These comforts we take for granted would seem miraculous to the medieval people whose lives we've explored. Yet as your room gradually cools and quiets, as all rooms do when night deepens, regardless of technological advancement, there remains something universal in the experience of darkness gathering, of seeking warmth and light against encroaching cold. In this moment, the distance between yourself and those medieval peasants perhaps narrows slightly. The fundamental human experience of winter, its challenges and its strange beauty, creates a thread connecting across centuries. Those medieval villagers, wrapped in their scratchy war garments, sleeping on rustling straw beneath inadequate coverings, seem distant from us in their material circumstances. Their empty stomachs, their chilblained hands, their smoky dwellings all reflect hardships we've engineered away through centuries of technological development. We need not romanticize genuine suffering to recognize that something profound existed within their winter experience, a direct encounter with seasons turning that our climate-controlled environments have largely eliminated. Their winters demanded continuous attention to fire that needed tending, to food stores requiring careful rationing, to community members whose survival depended on mutual assistance. This necessary medicine created relationship with winter that was simultaneously more difficult and more intimate than our modern experience. They couldn't ignore winter's reality. We can sometimes pass entire cold seasons barely acknowledging nature's rhythm beyond wardrobe adjustments and occasional travel inconvenience. And yet, the world they inhabited was never simply cold. It contained moments of startling beauty, sunlight sparkling across unmarked snow, frost patterns delicate as lace across window openings, the hushed quality of sound after nighttime snowfall. Their senses, undiminished by constant stimulation, likely registered these phenomena with an intensity we might envy, each moment of beauty precious precisely because comfort was not guaranteed. The medieval winter world wasn't heroic in conventional terms, no epic battles against elements, no glorious triumphs over nature appear in historical records. Instead, we find the quiet nobility of endurance of ordinary people rising each morning to face another cold day, tending necessary tasks, maintaining community bonds, preserving hope for spring's eventual return. There is dignity in this persistence that transcends their technological limitations, suggesting something essential about human resilience that remains relevant despite our changed circumstances. They didn't document their winter experiences in diaries or memoirs. Literacy remained limited to privileged few, yet they wrote their stories in other ways, in folk tales passed between generations, in seasonal traditions that structured communal life, in practical knowledge transmitted through demonstration and practice. Most significantly, they wrote warmth into each other's lives through necessary cooperation and shared experience. The emotional warmth of human connection helped counterbalance physical cold when material resources proved insufficient. Today, our digital hearths flicker with different light. Screens rather than flames often gather family members. Virtual connections sometimes replace physical proximity. We face different winter challenges: seasonal affective disorder, holiday stress, the peculiar loneliness that can persist despite constant connectivity. Yet beneath these modern manifestations, similar human needs remain: for light against darkness, warmth against cold, connection against isolation. Winter still tests us, albeit in subtler ways than our ancestors faced. So tonight, as your own surroundings cool toward sleep, perhaps you'll think differently about those medieval peasants whose winter experiences we've explored. The centuries separating us haven't fundamentally changed certain human constants. We still seek shelter, sustenance, and meaning. We still gather toward warmth, whether physical or emotional. We still tell stories to make sense of darkness. Winter still asks something of us, even if its demands have softened. The world those medieval people inhabited was undeniably cold, but they weren't alone in facing it. They had each other. Community, however imperfect, provided resources no individual could maintain. Shared knowledge offered solutions beyond personal experience. Collective memory preserved hope that current hardships would eventually yield to better seasons. These social dimensions of survival remain instructive even when physical challenges have diminished. Their fire is long extinguished, their voices silent for centuries. Yet something of their winter wisdom remains accessible if we listen carefully, not to romanticize hardship, but to recognize the human capacity for finding meaning even within constraint. Their story settles into our modern understanding like snow gradually accumulating, transforming familiar landscape into something that invites fresh perspective. The fire is low now, its glow diminishing as this exploration concludes, but perhaps its warmth lingers in newly awakened appreciation for comforts we typically overlook. In recognition of seasonal rhythms that continue despite technological buffers, in awareness of human continuity across centuries of winter challenges, medieval people survived their winters through necessity and adaptation. We navigate ours with different tools but similar human needs. And perhaps, for now, that recognition of continuity amid change is all we need, a small flame of understanding carried forward, illuminating both past experience and present moment with its quiet, steady light.